Hello, and welcome to Epically High Prices for IKONic Ski Resorts, a presentation by Cole Rittenauer, Isaiah Kramer, and Joshua Gluck. In recent years, ski lift ticket prices have reached levels that less than 10 years ago would have seemed inconceivable. In some cases, prices have soared as high as $200 per day. All three of us are skiing enthusiasts and have been faced with these steep prices. We're interested in finding out what caused these rather drastic increases in fees, especially in West Coast skiing, which is dominated by two ski resort conglomerates, Epic and Icon. While inflation is in part responsible for this rise in ticket prices, today's fares far outreach inflation. The intention of this econometric analysis is to explore the factors contributing to the lift ticket prices. The research question we examined was, what are the primary determinants of the maximum market price of a single day lift ticket across US-based ski resorts? The proxy for this was a single day adult weekend lift ticket. Our hypothesis was that the average annual snowfall, skiable acreage, snowmaking, high-speed lifts, vertical feet, proximity to a metropolitan area, and membership in the ICON or EPIC consortium are the key drivers for the variation in adult weekend single-day lift ticket prices amongst the different ski resorts we examined. In order to gather up-to-date, near-complete data on comparable variables across all US ski resorts, we use a web scraper to aggregate data from On the Snow. It is the US-centered repository for data collected by Ski Info AS. On the Snow collects and reports data from its 421 US-based ski resorts and utilizes an annual survey issued independently to each ski resort. The data used in our analysis is from the 2018-2019 ski season. We spent considerable time cleaning the raw data and reduced the observations to 302 resorts for our purposes. The sample represents all of the ski resorts which reported complete information and contained all of the ski resorts with which we were collectively familiar with. For the Y variable, we used adult weekend single day lift ticket price. It is our dependent variable and acts as a proxy for maximum price viable according to market parameters. In reality, the vast majority of our single-day lift ticket prices are typically sold at a discount to face value, either because they are sold as a package deal or through promotional efforts. The maximum price should be indicative of what market considers the highest possible price per ticket. We started with 77 variables and ultimately narrowed it down to 24 for the independent variable. We hypothesized that proximity to metropolitan area will be the most statistically significant, since accessibility is a major factor in demand for ski lift tickets. We determined a binary variable to distinguish between remote resorts and those within 100 driving miles of a metropolitan area of 100 plus million people, with the help of Google Maps. Geographic variables such as region or state make up the majority of the variables, while other relevant variables such as multi-resort passes, type of lift operation, reputation or prestige, vertical drop, length of the ski season, and base elevation are also included. Here's a visual summary of the US ski resort industry. Most ski resorts in the United States are independent for now. You can see that from the clustering above the label No Pass on the bottom left corner. Oddly, there seems to be a ceiling of $100 on those independent resorts, maybe a reflection of where prices would be industry-wide without corporate ownership. Perhaps corporate ownership is what allows resorts to break that ceiling by investing in capital projects and operational efficiencies at a greater scale than it is possible without corporate credit market access. Epic and Icon, the two major players in the multi-resort space, tend to charge much more on average at their resorts. Notably, Epic resorts have a wider range in prices than the resorts on the other surveyed passes. There does not appear to be a network premium, meaning that resorts can charge more because of their club's reputation, by being on the Peak, Powder, Power, and Freedom passes. However, this model does not account for season pass prices, which tend to be higher for multi-resort passes vis-a-vis a single resort pass. You may be wondering which resort charges an astronomical $200+ a day to go skiing, and the answer is Vail Resort in Colorado, the crown jewel of the Vail Resorts, the owner of the Epic Pass.
So I'm going to begin here with a review of the literature we read um, with regard to our subject. So in terms of creating an effective price model and answering the question of how we determine the factors influencing price, two papers were particularly influential on our project. In the first, an Austrian economist named Martin Falk, who actually undertook a similar project in Europe, helped show us some issues we might run into and how we could address those. It was also interesting to compare the variables that we had access to in this project and the variables he had access to for his. We had more variables at our disposal, and I won't say that we necessarily created a better model, because we probably didn't, but we did end up incorporating different aspects than he did in his project, which was interesting to note. The second paper is somewhat related to the aspect we address in the next slide, which is conglomeration among resort owners, but it was also instructive on how we address that issue within our price modeling. So one particularly central aspect of our question for this project was what the effect of the increased conglomeration of ski resorts within the US might be on the price of ski tickets. Specifically, we focused on the EPIC Pass market dominance, which we determined resembled a duopoly in many ways. Given the fact that it only seems to be growing and will likely continue to do so in future years, we wanted to know whether this sort of conglomeration was good or bad for consumers. To that end, we examined a number of papers that concentrated on this question. The first two looked at different aspects of oligopolies and duopolies, such as quality standards in relation to market dominance in the first one, and quality signaling through prices in the second one. The final paper, however, was especially useful for us. It was again by Martin Falk, who is somewhat prolific on this topic, and it looks at the efficiency of different multi-resort conglomerations across the US, France, and Switzerland. And it concludes that multi-resort conglomerations are almost universally less efficient than independent resorts, which has interesting ramifications for price point differentiation in our project. Let's move on to the model. So to understand the variables, we can see that our dependent variable, which is what we used as a proxy for the maximum price the market was willing to pay for a lift ticket. And then we have our initial 77 variables. These represented the type of pass, so whether it was a multi-resort pass, and if so, whether that pass was an Icon, an Epic, or one of the other multi-resort passes. The size and dimensions, such as the base and peak height, the total surface area, and different aspects like that. The operational efficiency, which was represented by the types of chairs that were offered, such as whether there were a lot of high-speed chairs or gondolas or other things like that. And then the bonus aspects and intangibles, which we hypothesized were important for differentiation and included aspects like train parks, the length of the season, and whether the resort was well known. Finally, we addressed the location, as we expected this might be an important aspect. We included dummy variables for every state as well as 6 regions, and we wondered about the extent to which being close to a city of significant size impacted the price. So we created an additional dummy variable that represented whether the resort was within 100 miles of a major metro area. Moving on to the OLS problems, we expected that we would be more likely to encounter the first two there, multicollinearity and heteroscedasticity, and not so much autocorrelation, given that we were not working with a time series. So we decided to disregard autocorrelation, which is something that should be considered in our final results. Initially, we simply plugged every variable into a regression, and it gave us a mean VIF of 33.5, which is pretty much ridiculously high. In order to fix this, we could A, acquire more data, B, apply a new model, or C, cut the problem variables loose. Acquiring more data wasn't really realistic. We have a lot of data to begin with, and we didn't see any instances where we would actually be able to acquire more from any sorts of sites. And with regard to making a new model, we didn't have a time series aspect, so first differencing was not viable. Composite indexing held a little more promise, but we also realized that a number of our variables were essentially composite indexed already, such as regions being a form of composite indexing for states. So we took advantage of that when we decided to cut down the variables. In our particular model, this actually made a lot of sense because the high correlation between a large number of our variables. We combed through these in order to distinguish which high VIF variables were strongly correlated and use this to inform our modifications. This didn't mean that we necessarily deleted all the high VIF values though. Multicollinearity was a difficult challenge we faced in our modeling, um, but our final result had a mean VIF that was well within the range we were looking for, and we decided that because we were not concerned with prediction or forecasting, it was necessary for us to focus on reducing multicollinearity to the extent that was reasonably possible, even if this came at a cost to um, the variables we were using. We believe we've done a good job of balancing issues of multicollinearity with the explanatory power of our model, but there's always room for debate on this. Moving on to issues of heteroscedasticity, we were left with a few unresolved issues of this occurring within our model. In this first instance, we're regressing price versus the size of a resort in terms of area and number of chairs. It's clearly heteroscedastic, and we weren't able to resolve that. And we can also see that the same is true in this instance of price versus average annual snowfall. So while we think the model itself was sufficiently homoscedastic, there were smaller issues of heteroscedasticity that we think were outweighed by good homoscedastic examples. Um, so that's it for the modeling part. And it leads us to the final revised modeling, 10 quantitative variables and 5 dummy variable categories. So in the passes, which pass it was, variable for how famous the resort was. We reduced and actually dropped the state variables here and replaced them just with the regional variables because of the issues of high correlation there. And then we were left with 2 other dummy variables. And that composite results in our final model.
So we want to visualize that there are very few resorts that can command $100 a day or more for lift tickets. You know, that's a very expensive outing. The distribution of lift ticket prices is, as you can see here, unimodal and positively skewed. There is some kurtosis on one side, as you can see from the fat long tail on the right. Our measures of central tendency give a median value of about $63 and a mean of $78. For the purpose of simplifying our independent variable, we want to represent the typical cost for an adult to go skiing at a given resort. However, ski resorts tend to charge $9 less on average during weekdays than on weekends. We theorize that this is because supply is constant throughout the week. However, demand typically spikes on weekends when people aren't working and can spend their disposable income, given that skiing is an all-day event typically. In order to establish a proxy for the typical cost for an adult to go skiing at a given resort, we modeled that 94% of the variation in adult weekend lift ticket price is explained by the corresponding adult weekday lift ticket price. Thus, we concluded that a ski resort's pricing scheme could be adequately represented by its adult weekend day lift ticket price, which is the independent variable that we constantly refer to in this results section. Essentially, here looking for a proxy to say this is like the typical cost to go skiing. So we had some type of way to rank the various resorts. Here's that relationship visualized. You can even see that there's a straight line that can be fitted for resorts that charge the same for both weekday and weekend lift ticket prices. The first multi-factor regression analysis was aimed at determining the quote-unquote network effect of multi-resort passes. Multi-resort passes are effectively upselling a skier, Knowing that they will ski enough days to justify buying a season pass, a skier may elect a more expensive pass because it gives them a greater number of resorts to choose from. So in aggregate, a ski resort is making more money off a given skier, or the multi-resort pass vendors, rather. It is unclear if this effect increases microeconomic demand for number of days skied, or whether a skier skis a relatively fixed number of days and all else equal, but distributes those days to a greater number of resorts. It is also unclear if offering these products has increased aggregate purchasing of season passes. Given the recent growth in multi-resort season passes, we speculate that these new offerings have kindled greater demand for season passes. I, for one, ski more days because I have an increased number of options to ski from, and that sort of whets my appetite for skiing, whereas I would become sort of bored if I was skiing the same resort time and time again. So now I can pivot and, uh, create my vacations around going to a certain destination. What is clear is that resorts on the Icon and Epic passes, compared to those not on either pass, tend on average to charge $59 and $67 more, respectively. The network effect was also observable for the Power Pass, meaning that a multi-resort pass compared a premium, all else equal, to resorts on a pass commanded a premium or could charge more than resorts not on these multi-resort passes. Collectively, being on a pass explains roughly 50% of the variation observed in adult weekend lift ticket prices, reflecting that these pass vendors have substantial influence on industry pricing power. And this is substantiated in economic theory through the concept of market structure monopolization. And the consolidation allows suppliers greater supplier power and thus can charge more. We extended the above model to test the economic value of the network effect, holding which multi-resort pass a resort is a member of, and all else constant. This network effect is statistically significant and demonstrated by the pass coefficient, which suggests that being on a pass, on average, increases the adult weekend lift ticket price by $37. All else equal, an adult weekend day lift ticket resort at an average resort around the country costs about $60. A regression analysis of a region's effect on adult weekend day lift ticket prices confirmed our hypothesis that the relatively flat, meaning there aren't a whole lot of ski resorts, or the ski resorts that exist aren't very large, in the Mid-Atlantic and Midwest regions were not major ski markets, and lift ticket prices reflect that notion. This is the analysis I like to call the economic drivers of lift ticket pricing regression model. This model includes all the variables that we identified to materially determine the value of a lift ticket, or the metrics that we would use to determine our preference of ski resorts to visit. Reputation or prestige, vertical drop, length of ski season, base elevation, the size and speed of the lift operation, and snowmaking coverage all had a statistically significant effect on adult weekend day ticket price. Collectively, these values explain a whole 79% of the variation in lift ticket pricing. We can see that there is much greater concentration of ski resorts at lower altitudes and lift ticket prices around $60, as mentioned earlier. I found it particularly interesting that the distribution is heteroscedastic, with residuals much smaller at the smaller resorts. In smaller resorts measured in terms of the size of the mountain, the vertical drop. In economic theory, we can infer that there is a lack of differentiation among these smaller resorts and greater differentiation among the bigger resorts, which is what allows them to charge more for their lift tickets on average. If you follow a cost-based pricing model, it follows that larger resorts are more costly to operate and thus charge more. Just consider the additional terrain clearing, lift servicing, snowmaking, etc. So, two ways of looking at it. You can charge more if you're a bigger mountain because your costs are higher, or you can charge more because you're more differentiated. You're offering a premium service by offering a larger mountain and the array of skiing associated with that. It would seem that one of the most significant determinants in lift ticket pricing is vertical feet. That is, the greater the difference between the top and bottom of a ski resort, the higher the premium a ski resort can command. In my own experience, a higher lift ticket price is typically justified by having longer runs and more consistent snow quality that is typical of taller mountains. Lastly, we want to discern whether the proximity of a mountain to a major metropolitan area affected pricing, the idea being that more remote mountains have less demand, while resorts close to urban areas may be flooded with demand. Sure enough, resorts within 100 miles of a metro area with a population of at least a million people charge $27 more on average. After all this analysis, we refined our model to have the greatest level of explanatory power given our dataset. This regression model explains a full 84% of the variation in adult weekend day lift ticket prices. In other terms, we have identified we believe that our model's explanatory power explains 84% of the variation in lift ticket prices with the following economic variables. To wrap up, I just want to spend a moment to talk about some of the shortcomings of our analysis, some areas in which we would like to improve. Most importantly, we would like, if we were to expand this analysis, to incorporate panel data that is analyzing these metrics over a time series, and we think that would yield additional insights as to whether the trends we have observed hold up over time. One trend that we wish we could investigate is multicollinearity in multiple variables. For example, perhaps ski resorts on the IKONic lift tickets were already significantly more expensive than the average ski resort. Perhaps there are other factors that make a resort a likely acquisition target of the IKONic passes that were wrongly attributed as the passes themselves contributing economic value via the network effect. So this would be an example of misspecification in the model. Another multicollinearity issue is based on geographic relationships on pricing. Some regions, states, have on average mountains of greater prominence, and thus ski resorts with greater vertical, which has a strong positive relationship with lift ticket prices. So this again would be a case of misspecification in the model that we would hope to filter out if we were taking a sample set over time. Overall, we observed conclusive evidence that having an efficient lift system, long runs, proximity to a metropolitan area, and most notably, membership in the IKON or EPIC consortium are the key variables in explaining the variation in adult weekend single-day lift ticket prices among the different ski resorts. For anyone looking for the references, data, and log files, those are all available in the attached repository that comes with this presentation. Thank you. Now we have reached the end of today's presentation. Thank you for watching.